This is Dr. Tim Rail with another story from my book, The Day That Changed Forever. Much has been written about the last week of Jesus' life and what happened around the cross. There are some characters in this drama that are very familiar, and some that have never been written very much about. In The Day That Changed Forever, I choose to write some stories about characters that little have heard about, but had huge implications in the overall story. This story, Judas. It wasn't supposed to end like this. He stood alone at the edge of the precipice, his eyes wild and unworldly, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged, wheezing, whimpering gasps. His hand tightly clutched one end of his money belt. The other was tied to the limb of the tree that stretched out over the valley of Hinnom below. Voices shouted at him from all directions, taunting, accusing, leering, laughing, pushing. Just one step into oblivion, and it would all be over. He was about to die, and they urged him on with fiendish delight, reveling in the sacrifice he was about to make to them. It wasn't supposed to end like this. This was to be the day his greatest dreams were to come true. His secret longings for himself and his nation gloriously coming to triumphant fruition. Everything was imploding in on him. Expectations, motivation, and manipulations he'd thought so securely under his direction had spun uncontrollably out of reach. His scheming secret strategy to step up to supreme ascension had disintegrated into a downward demonic descent to death. Judas had heard it said by others that just before a person dies, his life flashes before his eyes. Just before the moment of his own tortured demise, he found it was true. He'd grown up in a little town in Judea called Kiriath, not far from the capital of Jerusalem. The name his father Simon had given him was common, one of the two most often conferred on boy children. As with so many generations through history, names meant a blend of identification and expectation for those who carried them. Jesus and Judas, the two most popular names of the day, represented the longings and distinctiveness of their people. Jesus, Yeshua, as they pronounced it, meant salvation. It alluded to their national longing for their Messiah to come, the deliverer who would finally set them free from all oppression and tyranny. The occupation of the hated Romans had only intensified that yearning in their generation. Judah, or its derivatives such as Judah, meant praise, tied to their very name as a nation, Judea. They were to be the unique people among all the tribes and tongues of the earth, specially designated to represent Yahweh and reveal His glory to all nations. This distinctive was a cause for great pride and preservation. They were God's chosen to carry on His traditions and revelations. Living so close to Jerusalem, where the temple stood as the national center of religious passion, and the fortress of Antonia located near it represented Romans' political oppression, had a striking and ongoing effect on a young boy growing into manhood. The line between loyalty to God and duty to country blurred until they were indiscernible. Outward shows of religious piety were allowed, but overt political protests were violently and quickly smashed by Roman steel with deadly efficiency. Covert bands of men fueled by religious zeal and angry patriotism formed to fight the hated occupiers through stealth and subversion. They were called zealots. One of the most deadly groups became known as the Sicarii because of their preference for sudden slashing strikes with sharp steel. What they couldn't shout to a soldier's face in public, they did with the thrust of a knife from the shadows. Judas found himself a part of a movement whose ends justified any means. Verbally, they proclaimed the values of faith, freedom, family, country, But in reality, whatever was deemed expedient made embracing those values expendable. Each small victory was celebrated, but when he looked at the bigger picture, he realized they were making pitiful progress. They were a pariah to the general public and public enemy number one to the Romans. Judas had always been a calculating man. Short of stature, he was always trying to project a larger profile to those around him. People often remarked that there seemed to be a lot going on behind those sharp, dark eyes of his, as if he was always trying to see things from a bunch of different angles and figure out which angle worked best for him. He moved to Jerusalem, where his attention to details and love of money led him to work in the temple treasury, the People's Bank. People had to pay a fee to exchange money with Roman images on it, designated unclean because it was desecrated by a Gentile affiliation, to the temple currency developed by the religious leaders with the approved symbols on them. The symbols and the obscene profits were all that mattered to the priests running the religious machine. Any spiritual resemblance was just a facade for the vast empire they ruled. Judas watched, listened, learned, and skimmed a share for his own profit he felt appropriate, but not discernible. Why not? It fit the reality of that culture. Position triumphed over humble piety, power trumped humility, politics tainted any real spirituality. As much as the high priest, the ruling council called the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees and Pharisees and priests that made up the strata of religious leaders denounced Rome's occupation with righteous indignation to the common folks that filled the temple courts, behind the scenes they cut deals that would allow them to maintain their power and income. The temple that stood shining in the sunlight uncovered an ugly underbelly of hypocrisy and greed. He was living in two worlds, the secret life of a Sicarii zealot and the outward life of a public servant working in God's temple. He learned how to get what he wanted in both environments, developing the art of always being where important people and decisions were being made, and influencing things to his benefit with a suggestion or observation inserted at a tactical moment, yet without somehow being obvious or very visible. He enjoyed the ability to manipulate people into doing his bidding, while all the time they thought they were acting on their own ideas. Both worlds nourished his underlying motivation of greed and ambition. A small man, unnoticed by most, Judas harbored ambitions and greed far bigger than anyone realized. Neither world, he realized, would get him to his final destination. Both patriots and priests were contaminated by priorities too personal and petty to accomplish the bigger picture. A nation purged from outside oppression, living out his intended destiny, with Judas himself well situated in a position of power, wealth, and security. That unseen motivation was fueled by his own ambition, and though he did not recognize it, also increasingly fed by dark, unseen spiritual influences. There had to be something else, better, someone else, who could bring together all the competing agendas and groups, someone who could unite and galvanize the people into an unstoppable, conquering force. That was what the Messiah was for. Judas' messianic vision focused on someone that activated the political liberation instead of personal salvation. People longed for and talked about the coming Messiah. Occasionally, someone would rise to capture people's attention with their rhetoric or claims of supernatural help, but like the falling stars he often saw in the night skies above their land, they appeared brilliantly but briefly and quickly flamed out into obscurity. One day, as he listened to the gospel around the temple, his ears perked up as a new name started creating a buzz of interest. At first, he dismissed what he was hearing. The man was from Galilee, considered by more sophisticated Jerusalemites as lower class, backwoods, and definitely unappealing. The thought of a national hero arising from Galilean Hicksville didn't make any sense. Still, stories continue to circulate about a carpenter from Nazareth, and Judas' finely tuned radar determined that a trip north may not be a bad idea. When he got there, he was impressed in spite of himself. It wasn't hard to locate Jesus of Nazareth. Both the local synagogue leaders and nearly everyone else was aware of where Jesus was and what he was doing. He had appeared almost out of nowhere, known only as a well-regarded, unassuming man running his father's carpentry business until recently. And then, for no apparent reason, he had suddenly stepped into a place of people's attention. Stories about him turning water into wine at a wedding and teaching that captivated people's attention far more than any of the local preachers began to dominate conversations at common gathering places. So, Jesus found the Nazarene's latest whereabouts and joined the crowd that had gathered to see what he'd do next. Jesus didn't disappoint. There was nothing showy or spectacular about Jesus. He looked ordinary enough and made no moves to call attention to himself. Yet, as Judas observed with cynical, objective, appraising eyes, everything Jesus did was extraordinary. What he did, what he said, how people responded to him. This Jesus was a magnet, appealing to people's deepest needs and longing in a way Judas had never seen before. Not only did he appeal to them, he met them. Judas had seen religious hucksters making big claims as a prelude to asking for even bigger offerings. People's temporary emotional highs supposedly represented physical healing or spiritual deliverance, so artfully crafted by the spiritual showman, quickly dissipated after the show was done. Judas had seen some of the best their region had to offer around Jerusalem. But this Jesus, it was as if he deliberately tried not to call attention to himself, and he didn't ask for money. This one was different. Almost before he realized it, the man who started on the edges of the crowd as an observer found himself drawn closer to learn more about Jesus. He began to join the smaller groups of people that followed Jesus to more private settings after the public events had concluded. Occasionally, he asked a question in his typical indirect way to probe more into the Nazarene's real identity and agenda. Jesus always turned his way, looking him in the eye, and answered his questions directly in a way that addressed the issue while even raising more questions in Judas' mind at the same time. Mostly, he listened and watched and wondered, could it be that the one person he'd been looking for that could fulfill his messianic expectations was here in the person of Jesus of Nazareth? He wasn't convinced, but the fact that so many other people seemed to be making a big impression on him. Jesus calculated what his involvement with the Galilean might be. It was only a matter of days before his opportunity came. Jesus climbed up on one of the high spots of the region one night, saying he needed to spend some time with his Father. He'd stayed there all night, and when he came back down the next morning, he told the group waiting for him that he wanted some of them to come with him as his disciples. This would be his inner circle, the ones who would get to know the real man, the real story, the real agenda. If this Jesus was a realistic possibility to meet Judas' expectations, this was the group to belong to. He stepped closer, consciously making himself more visible. Jesus began to go to particular men, one at a time, looking them in the eye, putting his hand on their shoulder, making his invitation to this level of discipleship very personal. Peter, James, and John, brothers, who Jesus had nicknamed Sons of Thunder for their famous tempers, Andrew, Peter's quiet brother. These were all fishermen from up Capernaum way. The invitations continue. Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, a local tax collector who Judas had learned was a cousin of Jesus, James, the son of Alphaeus, Thaddeus, Simon, who Jesus knew about from his network of fellow zealots, all were from Jesus' region of the country. To make the normal group of 12, he'd have to pick one more. Jesus paused, looking thoughtfully around the group. Many eager, expectant faces returned his gaze, silently pleading for him to invite them. Then, as if coming to a conclusion, he stepped over to Judas and invited him. "Judas, would you join me?" he asked, looking intently into his eyes. And with a simple yes, Judas was in. From the very beginning, he felt like an outsider. He was the only one that wasn't from Galilee, and he had a hard time keeping his natural prejudice against people from that region in check. He stayed a bit detached, always with the group, trying to act as if he was joining in, yet holding himself back. He continued to watch and evaluate to see how his expectations were lining up with the reality of being part of Jesus' team. The crowds continued to grow. People began to support the itinerant carpenter teacher, to assist his ministry, or to give out a sheer gratitude after Jesus had met their or a loved one's needs. Judas suggested that he had a background working with money, and Jesus appointed him the group's financial manager. He kept careful track of income and even more careful oversight of the outflow of the money. He kept all the money right with him in a money belt he wrapped securely around him. It provided security for a man whose identity was so closely tied to money. As he did before, he quietly paid himself a small percentage from the ministry account for his services. Jesus never seemed to pay attention to the financial side of things, saying often that if they would put God's kingdom first, his Father would make sure all their needs were met. They always had more than they needed, and Jesus regularly directed Jesus to give generously to people with requests for help. Judas obeyed reluctantly, hating every time he had to give their money to people he felt didn't deserve it. No one seemed to notice, because Judas was a master at hiding his true feelings and intentions. Yet, Jesus would often give Judas a look of encouragement and knowing warning when he saw those dark eyes cloud over with frustration after yet another directive to share liberally. Following Jesus was both exhilarating and troubling at the same time to Judas. All the components making Jesus a singular galvanizing leader to lead the nation appeared to be coming into place. The rising groundswell of popularity, the blend of religious teaching and extraordinary results, the hints from well-placed sources that the support Jesus had could be leveraged strategically when the right time came. Judas kept his contacts back to the zealots and religious leaders active. At the right time, what troubled Judas was that Jesus seemed oblivious to the opportunities to advance such an agenda. He called people to commitment, to follow God and serve others in love and holiness instead of fulfilling a personal or political agenda. He offered a life of freedom and joyful abundance regardless of external circumstances. Jesus was much too spiritual for Judas' liking. A more pragmatic approach was needed to make the most of these open doors. He'd hinted at this numerous times, but Jesus would just give him a knowing look, shake his head, and turn it into another teachable moment designed for the heart. He seemed impervious to Judas' attempts to help him along. There was no manipulating him. 3 years had gone by, and Judas was getting increasingly impatient and irritated. They traveled all over the region, only occasionally getting to Jerusalem, where the real action was. Judas had been unable to crack the innermost circle of 3 that Peter, James, and John occupied. Seeds of jealousy he'd allowed to take root in his heart sprouted and grew, watered by his own broodings and ambitions. The dark whispers from the shadows became more insistent and easier to listen to. Then, something shifted. They all felt it, and Jesus told them plainly one night. It was, he said, time to go to Jerusalem. For a brief moment, a surge of excitement rose within Judas. Perhaps this was the moment he'd been waiting for. It would be during Passover. The city would swell with multitudes of pilgrims in town for the religious festival. Some estimated the population of Jerusalem would grow upwards of 2.5 million people during that time. If there was ever a time to seize the moment, this would be it. Then Jesus continued, describing a scenario that absolutely made no sense at all. He would be betrayed, he said. He would suffer at the hands of the religious leaders, the very ones who were supposed to recognize and rise to confirm the Messiah plans for victory. He said he'd die, and then rise again in 3 days. From one perspective, this all fit perfectly into everything Jesus had been teaching about and living for. That was his mission. From Judas' perspective, it was the exact opposite of his expectations. What was he going to do now? As they walked toward Jerusalem, Judas calculated. If Jesus was truly headed towards a confrontation with the Romans and the Jewish leaders that ended in his death, then being identified with Jesus could easily mean his death too. With Jesus' death would come the end of his ministry and the end of the money Judas had managed and profited from. Judas wondered if there was a way to distance himself from Jesus, ingratiate himself with people of influence, and make some money at the same time. Or, with the right assistance, perhaps Jesus could be convinced to truly take his place as the political and religious king of the nation. If he was the Messiah, wouldn't this be the right time to ascend to power? Could he somehow make all these options work for his own benefit? The small man brooded, calculated, and then the whispers from the dark contributed to his inner conversation. They arrived on Sunday to vast, cheering throngs of people, a welcome fit for a king. Judas reveled in the adulation afforded him being associated with Jesus. This was going in the right direction. Then suddenly, things went in the opposite direction. The next day, Jesus threw the temple area into an uproar, upsetting the tables and neatly piled temple currency into a chaotic blur of rolling coins and sacrificial animals for sale, set free, scattering in all directions. "This is my Father's house, a house of prayer. How dare you turn it into a den of thieves?" He roared, his holy anger thrilling and magnificent to watch. People tired of being fleeced by the religious establishment for the privilege of worshiping God stood up and cheered. The money changers, temple workers, and priests shook their fists in protest and slunk into the background. Judas knew some of them, and the looks he saw on their faces made him suddenly feel hollow and almost ashamed. Jesus followed that with a sharp confrontation with the religious leaders, calling out Sadducees and Pharisees alike by exposing their sins they had hid so nicely under religious veneers. Any chance of getting their support was now seemingly obliterated. Later that night, Judas excused himself from the rest, saying he had errands to run to help their group make Passover preparations. But instead, he'd met with some of his temple contacts and found out that Caiaphas, the high priest, had convened a meeting to deal with the Jesus situation once and for all. He had declared it was better for one man to die for the way of life to be lost. But it was decided to find a way to arrest and get rid of Jesus away from the adoring crowds. This had to be done deliberately, discreetly, and delicately. When Judas heard that, something inside him trembled. This thing was coming to a head. His calculating mind raced faster. Was there still a way to rescue the situation? He felt pulled in so many directions. He wanted Jesus to live up to his expectations. After all, the Nazarene had always been good to him. His ambition still hoped for Jesus to become a king and Judas to benefit from that association. He wanted to protect himself in case the plans of the chief priest continued towards getting rid of Jesus. He didn't want any arrest warrant for Jesus and his followers to have his name on it. His greed still wanted to find an angle to make the situation profitable. The whispers from the darkness fed the ambition and greed with their own suggestions, and his confusions grew. Still, he hoped that somehow Jesus would find his way back to the right messianic path. When they ate an evening meal Wednesday night at the home of Simon and Bethany, things finally reached the breaking point. A woman came and broke a fine alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, pouring it first on Jesus' head and then anointing his feet. The beautiful fragrance of the act of love and the perfume filled the room, but all Judas could see was the price of a whole year's wages wasted. He protested under the guise of saying the money could have been used for the poor. But when Jesus rebuked him and said she was preparing his body in advance for his death and burial, Judas knew that if anything was to happen to force Jesus' hand in the direction Judas wanted him to go, he'd have to make it happen. Something beyond his ambitions compelled him. He left on another errand, and this time gained an audience with Caiaphas and his inner circle of advisors. They stood for a moment appraising each other. Caiaphas and Judas, both shrewd manipulators, trying to figure out how to gain the upper hand. "What will you give me to hand over Jesus of Nazareth to you?" Judas opened. Sudden interest and a gleam of triumph showed in Caiaphas' eyes. This was exactly what he'd been hoping for. Someone on the inside of Jesus' organization who could orchestrate the right scenario for his arrest. Speaking deliberately to try and hide his delight, Caiaphas questioned the little man to make sure he could deliver. He could. They set the price at 30 pieces of silver, the price of a slave, with a hint that this was just the first installment if things went as Judas promised. They shook hands on the deal, each one's palm feeling greasy to the other, each feeling they'd gotten the best part of the deal. Caiaphas was now indebted to Judas. No matter which way the situation went, he could take the side that best protected him. Caiaphas cared nothing for Judas. One piece of his plan he needed had fallen neatly into place. Judas began to look for the right time. The next day was filled with people, activity, and Passover preparations. Nothing presented itself, and Judas pondered. Where was a good place that was out of the way, easy to access under the cover of darkness, and offered escape routes if he needed one? Suddenly, he realized the right place. The garden at Gethsemane, where Jesus often took them to pray in the evenings, that would be just right. Late afternoon shadows were lingering across Jerusalem, where no one could see the shadows of darkness were getting stronger in Judas too. Always before, he'd been able to squelch the whispers when he wanted to, but with his decision to hand Judas over, they had gained more power. They crowded in on him, pressuring him, gaining more and more control. The Jesus team had gathered in an upper room Jesus had arranged to be prepared for the Passover meal. It was a sacred remembrance of their history, a tradition generations had followed. They all knew it by heart. Entering the room, Jesus quietly asked Judas to take the place to his left when they reclined at the low table, the place reserved for the honored guest. The host could lean his head back close to the person in that position and share privately. It was a position anyone invited to a meal would covet, and Jesus was inviting him to take that place. Judas nodded, confused. What was this supposed to mean? Did Jesus know something he had done? Why should he get this honor? They began the meal, enjoying the fellowship and food as part of the time-honored tradition. Jesus seemed unusually pensive, letting the conversation flow around him as others recapped their day. Judas glanced over at him several times, wondering. Then Jesus looked up, and the room fell silent, as the 12 sensed he was about to share something important. For a long moment, the room was quiet, but tension hung thickly in the air. Suddenly, they were going off the familiar script. Looking around the table at each one, Jesus said slowly, "One of you is going to betray me." The shock was immediate and visceral. What? One of them? They all began to protest at once, declaring their loyalty and asking who the traitor could be. Judas said nothing, quivering inside. One word from Jesus and he'd be exposed, and the other 11 would make sure he never left that room alive. John, reclining at Jesus' right, leaned his head back and whispered something to Jesus. Jesus whispered something back, too low for Judas to hear. John looked over at Peter at the end of the table and made the slightest nod of his head in Judas' direction. Jesus lifted his palm outward in a stop motion to Peter. Realized that he hadn't said anything yet. Judas spoke, his voice sounding unnatural from the strain, but he managed to get the words out. Surely not I, Rabbi. Not Lord. Not Master. Just Rabbi. Teacher. Then Jesus took a piece of bread from his plate, dipped it into the bowl of sauce in front of him, and turned to extend it to Judas. The simple gesture had incredible significance. When the host took from his own plate and offered it to one of the guests like that, it was a supreme indication of favor and friendship, an invitation to intimacy. As Jesus held the bread towards Judas, their eyes met, and the wordless conversation forever cemented Judas' destiny. He knew. Suddenly it was clear to Judas that Jesus knew Judas was his betrayer. Yet, with his extended hand, was the offer of the bread of friendship and one last chance to turn back from his betrayal. Here it was, the final choice. Friendship and committed to discipleship to Jesus on his terms, or a forced relationship where Jesus had to meet Judas' expectations on his terms. He chose. If he was going to be identified with Jesus, it would be on Judas' terms. He'd force the Nazarene's hand, if he truly was the Messiah, to do it according to Judas' plan. He leaned forward, smiling, and ate the bread from Jesus' hand. From the look in Jesus' eyes, Judas could tell he understood the choice he'd made. Speaking so low, it was hard for the others to hear. Jesus looked steadily into Judas' eyes and said, "Do what you're going to do, and do it quickly." A cold chill made Judas shudder involuntarily, and then that instant the door he'd closed to Jesus opened another to the darkness, and the darkness came rushing in. Suddenly, Judas was dimly aware of that he was under the control of another. The voices seemed to all clamor at once and then stop as if silenced. One voice, darker than any he'd ever heard, now directed him. It was time to go. Rising without another word, Judas wrapped his garment around him and left the room, leaving behind the puzzled gazes of the other disciples and the lingering image of the face of Jesus. And it was night. From then on, he felt as if he was operating at another person's coercion. He found his way back to the temple where Caiaphas waited. Money was counted into his hands. He put the money into his belt, tying it tightly about him. Somehow, it felt tighter than before, like it was squeezing him, slowly suffocating him. He was dully surprised when he saw the mob they'd assembled to arrest Jesus. There were dozens of fully armed Roman soldiers, temple guards with their uniforms and weapons, and other temple workers who'd grabbed the nearest thing they could find as a weapon. Priests with small ambitions, small reputations and big ambitions who wanted to get in on the action. Hundreds had assembled, armed to the teeth, to arrest the most peaceful man who'd ever walked the earth. The Dark One forced him forward until under the full Passover moon, the moonlight and flickering illumination of torches and lanterns casting eerie shadows as they went. The shadows seemed alive, grasping for him, taunting him. The dark pressure inside compelled him on. They're in the garden now, and Judas turned to the soldiers closest to me. Remember, the one I greet with a kiss is the one. That will be the signal. They continued on, the rumble of voices seen and unseen growing. In an open clearing in the midst of the olive trees, one man stood alone waiting for them. When Judas saw him, the dark one inside him seemed to rise in an ugly, unearthly pleasure. The betrayer was being used by another betrayer. Judas stepped forward, his voice smiling with an unnatural greeting. His face felt frozen, his movements wooden. Walking up to Jesus, he stopped and took a step away, breathing heavily. Jesus looked at him and said, "Friend, do what you come for." There was a pause. Judas could feel his heart beating, and then that dark, unseen hand pulled him forward, and he heard his voice as if someone else was using it. "Greetings, Rabbi." One last step, taking Jesus by the shoulders as a friend would greet a friend, Judas kissed him once, twice, and again for emphasis. Jesus looked down at him, and Judas felt like Jesus was reaching past the dark presence that possessed him to the real person submerged under their spiritual domination. Judas. Jesus' voice was overruling all the other voices and touching his heart one last time. You betray the Son of Man with a kiss? Judas stepped to the side. He'd done his part. Now Jesus was supposed to do his. All he had to do was take control like he'd done so many times before. Jesus stood tall and strong in the moonlight. "Who is it you are looking for?" he asked, loud enough so everyone could hear. Someone cleared his throat. "Jesus the Nazarene." It was hundreds against one, but the voice sounded a bit fearful. They had all heard what the Nazarene could do, and if he turned his power loose on them... "I am." Jesus' ringing response reverberated with divine power, and the force of his words pushed them to the ground. His response was the same response Moses got at the burning bush when he asked Yahweh's identity. They cringed, expecting divine wrath to swallow them up. Nothing happened. Jesus still stood, unwavering, in the moonlight, waiting for them. Again, the question came, "Who are you looking for?" Another voice answered, a bit bolder this time, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I told you, I am he. So if you're looking for me, then let the rest of these men go." A cry came from behind Jesus, and Peter came swinging out of the shadows, slashing with a short sword. A man fell to Judas' right, crying out in pain. The dozens of swords sliding from their scabbards filled the air. They were on the edge of a situation careening into deadly chaos. Jesus took control. He knelt and healed the man, reattaching a severed ear. Peter and the disciples ran. Judas stood there frozen in place. Tentatively, then, as if one man, the mob surged forward and surrounded Jesus. Rough hands grabbed him and tied his hands behind his back, forcing his thumbs up into his shoulders. Other hands formed fists and pummeled pent-up anxiety and anger on Jesus' face and body. Unseen voices cackled with glee as they saw his pain. Then the mob was gone, having captured their prey. Judas was forgotten. He stood alone. The evil one that had been using him left. His purpose was done. The darkness wouldn't need him anymore. For a long moment he stood there blinking, trying to comprehend what had just happened. Everything had gone according to his plan. Nothing was going according to plan. Slowly it dawned on him he'd been used by players in a much bigger game than he could comprehend on more levels than he could understand. Dumbly, he stumbled back the way he came, following the last vestiges of light from the departing mob. When he arrived at the courtyard of Caiaphas' home, it was filled with the remnant of the arresters and a growing number of others who'd heard the news and wanted to gawk at the unfolding events. For the middle of the night, the place was alive with laughter and anticipation. Those that recognized him congratulated him on his achievement. He delivered the one man they all wanted, making him their hero. Judas didn't feel like one. What now? Maybe Jesus could still exert himself. He'd waited all along with the others while the night wore on, hoping to hear some kind of word of what was happening. Fear began to grow as he realized that his calculations had gone entirely wrong and completely right by the ones who'd used him. Words started circulating in whispers around him. They declared a death sentence on Jesus. He'd go to Pilate in the morning, and with that news, Jesus knew Jesus' execution was certain. He heard Jesus' voice again. Judas, you betray the Son of Man with a kiss? A verse from Psalm 41 surfaced in his mind. Even my friend, who I trusted, one who ate my bread, has lifted up his heel against me. It was the betrayer's verse. Suddenly, he was gripped with a deep sense of remorse. He had betrayed an innocent man. This wasn't justice. It was sacrilege. It wasn't supposed to end like this. Wait, maybe there was one last move to try and undo the chain of events he'd willingly but unknowingly instigated. The law said that if he gave back the money, the deal he made with the high priest would be nullified. They'd have to let Jesus go. Surely they'd honor their own law. He felt the darkness closing in again, and as if now released, the voices came upon him with a vengeance, protesting, pushing, pounding at his mind, clawing at his spirit. Although he could see nothing, he was in sudden physical pain from the violence. Willing himself against the pressure, he walked in a weaving, almost careening path to the temple where he'd been paid by the priest. The first streaks of dawn were showing in the east. He staggered through the doorway, gasping with effort. He was drenched with sweat, his eyes bulging, lips quivering. The priest on duty turned to see a disheveled heap of a man in front of them, and it made them uneasy just to look at him. With visible effort he spoke, trying to restrain the madness around him. I have sinned. They smiled cynically at him, saying nothing. Hadn't he just been here hours earlier, a self-assured, conniving traitor? I've sinned, Judas said again. I've betrayed innocent blood, an innocent man. The unspoken words were, I want to call the whole thing off. They laughed at him. What do we care? That's your problem. What? These were priests, representatives of God. He just confessed sin. They were supposed to find a way for him to be forgiven, to make things right. They'd shut the door of restoration in his face. If there was no hope from them, then there was no hope. No hope. Now the voices reached shrieking intensity, and he groaned in agony at their onslaught. To the priest, it sounded like a trapped animal. Reaching under his cloak, he tore off his money belt and counted out 30 silver pieces with trembling hands. They had to take the money back. They had to take the money back! With a snarl, he threw the money at them, the ringing sounds of silver on stone loud in the room. Then he was gone. He never heard what the priest said next, and if he had, it would have only compounded his horror. They decided that since this was blood money, they couldn't use it for temple purposes, so they'd buy a field of blood as burial ground for those who were alienated from their own cemeteries by uncleanness, a place they called the Potter's Field. Unknowingly, they fulfilled another prophecy spoken by Jeremiah and recorded in Zechariah 11:12 and 13. Give me my wages. So they counted out for my wages 30 pieces of silver. Throw it to the potter, the Lord said to me. This magnificent price I was valued by them. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw it into the house of the Lord to the potter. Over the generations, that parcel had become a place of sacrifices to demons, of human slaughter and suffering and demonic gloom. Some thought it was the doorway to hell. Judas was on his way there now. He had no idea where he was going, but the voices did. They slashed and poked and prodded and pushed him as he ran headlong through the narrow streets, faster than his legs could carry him at times. Each time he fell, the voices clawed at him until he got up and lurched ahead again. They pushed out along the way until he reached the gate on the road that led to Bethlehem, now swollen full of incoming pilgrims. Judas swam against the incoming tide of people, legs churning, arms thrashing, leaving a wake of people staring in bewilderment after him. Outside the gate, the forces pushed him along a little path, clinging to the bottom of the wall that hung over the Valley Hinnom. The path clung on the edge of the sheer rock face. Far below were the sharp, jagged remnants of stone from the wall's construction, and the open arms of demonic destruction. The field he just purchased with his own blood money was down in the valley below him. He'd sold them his soul, and now he was going to pay. The soil that received the blood of countless sacrifices to Satan was about to receive his. A tree hung over the edge. Judas stopped, realizing he was still holding his money belt in his hand. That belt had represented his identity, his security. It had been his life. Now it was going to cause his death. He pushed on the trunk of the little tree, and it only moved slightly. Trembling, he climbed out on the trunk and leaned on a branch. It gave way a little more. The voices were so loud now he couldn't hear. They snarled, taunted, cajoled, jeered, accused. No hope, no hope, no hope, no hope, no hope. He tied one end of his money belt to the limb. The other he wrapped around and around his neck. No hope, no hope, no hope, no hope, no hope. It wasn't supposed to end like this. He whimpered at the thought of what was coming, but the voices kept pushing. Leaning forward, he let go. His body fell downward, suddenly stopping with a jerk as the belt stretched taut. For a moment he swung back and forth as life was squeezed out of him. Then the branch snapped and he fell headlong, face first, into the sharp rocks below that looked like the bared teeth of a gaping open mouth. With a sickening sound, his guts splattered across the stones, and the soil lapped up by his blood as it spilled on the ground. The betrayer had been betrayed by his own ambitions and expectations and manipulations, by satanic forces that turned his calculations and decisions back on him, by trying to force God to submit to his own plans, and with everyone who insists on his own way over God's. His choices killed him. Judas was dead before the Messiah who would give his life for betrayers like him.